Today I wanted to show you a film I've been working on, and I've been working on this with my son, who's a professional cinematographer and filmmaker. And we're in the midst of creating a feature-length documentary that we're calling right now Disposable Humanity. And Disposable Humanity is an effort to understand what happened to disabled people who found themselves in psychiatric institutions in Nazi Germany during World War II. So it's a very specific historical moment, and it's a very particular population. It's German disabled people who have been diagnosed with psychiatric disabilities primarily, but really the category of disability is this kind of wide-ranging, overlapping category that includes physical disability, psychiatric disability, cognitive disability, sensory impairment like deafness, blindness, so on and so forth. And back in 1990, my research partner Sharon Snyder and I were giving a paper in Frankfurt, Germany. Frankfurt, Germany is up in the northwestern corner of the country of Germany. It was at a university we had been invited to present. We were doing work on American eugenics, and particularly on the removal of disabled people from social order, the social circuit of American citizenry. And as we presented our work, and we talked about this kind of multi-pronged approach that we saw eugenics standing beyond the project of institutionalization, which meant the passage of marriage laws, for instance, where you had to get a blood test before you were deemed fit to get married. And the blood test was an effort to track down defective heredity. Secondly, institutionalization. Institutionalization as in the way that Foucault and Birch talk about it, that we've been thinking about over the course of the semester. Removal from public participation of people with disabilities. Third, the US implemented a very coercive, comprehensive system of sterilization. And sterilization began in the early 1900s. And here's what the exchange was. If you were institutionalized for having a disability and you consented to be sterilized by the state, you could return to public circulation. You could be released from the institution because your reproductive threat to the nation was no longer active. And eugenics really is the kind of primary prohibition on disabled people from passing on their defective genetics to the next generation. So there were marriage laws that prohibited people from marrying if they had a history of a disability or they were diagnosed with a disability. Institutionalization, withdrawal from participation in the public sphere. 3, sterilization, the removal of one's reproductive capacity, and then with the potential or possibility of release, although many people were not released. And one of the things in the United States that we have been presenting on in Frankfurt was the fact that 63,000 disabled people were coercively sterilized by the state through 1962. So it was a very wide-ranging program, began in the early 1900s, went all the way into the 1960s and beyond in some ways. So we presented on our research on this, and I remember there was an audience much like this, in tiered seats in a university lecture room. And there was one older gentleman who used a cane who was sitting out in the audience. And after everybody had asked their questions and we talked about our research and what people were thinking about as they heard it, this old gentleman got up. Our host said, "Are there any other questions?" and this old gentleman got up and he gave a very impassioned speech in German. He was very upset. And our host wouldn't translate what he was saying because either she thought it wasn't right or it was too cantankerous or critical or something like that. And my partner Sharon and I, we said, "Oh, please translate what he's saying. We'd like to understand it." And she said, "Well," he was like, you discussed American eugenics and the kind of devastation that it imposed upon the disability population in the United States. And I wanted to point out that we had our own eugenics project in Germany, particularly during World War II. And it happened right up the street from here in a town called Hadamar. It's just about a half an hour away from Frankfurt. And in Hadamar, there was a psychiatric institution where German people with psychiatric diagnoses were institutionalized. And he said, you really need to add, if you take in the German situation, you really need to add a fourth thing to your list: marriage prohibition, institutionalization, sterilization, and the last one is mass murder. And my partner and I were like, okay. And, we're like, so the lecture ended and we talked to the gentleman a little bit further. And then we're like, okay, we need to rent a car and go up to Hadamar and find out what he's talking about. So we rented a car and we drove up to Hadamar and met a director. His name was Uta Georga. She was the director of the memorial site at the psychiatric hospital. And it turned out that more than 10,000 disabled people have been killed at the Hadamar Psychiatric Institution. And it had began in 1939, in the fall of 1939. And it took place in sealed rooms that were called gas chambers. And that the rooms that were set up and we went down in the basement, and the things in Germany is one can visit these killing center sites and walk through the apparatus of mass murder. This is largely not true with Holocaust memorial sites, for instance, because Jewish people who were in prison there destroyed the camps after they were released in a completely reasonable act of trying to eliminate or erase the evidence of the violence that they experienced and the trauma that they had experienced. And so she took us down to the basement at Hadamar. And one of the things about Nazi killing centers is they're not accessible. This might be a terrible irony of the fact that you're killing tens of thousands of disabled people in psychiatric institutions. So we had to kind of slide down the stairs and get to the bottom of them. And this happened actually over and over again, because it turns out that there were 6 killing centers set up by the Nazis during World War II. One was in Hadamar, the place that we're in. The first one was set up in Brandenburg, just outside of Berlin. The second one was established in Grapple, which is in the southwestern corner of Germany. There was one in just over the line from Germany and Austria called Hartheim Castle, and one in Sonnenstein-Pirna, which is right near the border of Czechoslovakia with the Czech Republic, as it's known today as the Czech Republic. So these killing centers had been going on. They were set up essentially in each region of Germany. And the goal was to eliminate disabled people, German disabled people who were in psychiatric institutions, who were deemed ineligible to do any productive work, even if that productive work was defined as within the walls of the institution, not like going out and being employed, the people who could do the work of making the institution self-sustaining. And when you visit these killing centers, you realize that there's a kind of modern principle that organize, which is that they're set up on an assembly line of death. One can produce cars, in the early 20th century on an assembly line. Fordist production was all about putting people into different skill sets and having a belt move down the way, and each person adds their cog to the machine that they're building. And the Nazis adapted that idea of assembly line production, and they shifted it to killing in these killing centers in Nazi Germany. So when you go through the remaining apparatus of mass murder that was used in psychiatric institutions, they all look very similar. There's an intake room. And the intake room is a place where people who were bused from other institutions came to the killing center. And they were met by a group of nurses. And the nurses brought them into the intake room, and they checked again who they were against their medical records to make sure the people who were supposed to be there were there. And then a physician who was stationed in the intake room did like a cursory medical exam of each patient. And the cursory medical exam had one goal in mind, not so much to determine, make sure this person had a severe enough disability that they qualified for the criteria of mass killing. But in order to make sure that when the death certificate was printed out after they had been gassed in the gas chamber, that the death certificate itself had a false cause of death that was plausible. So for instance, you didn't want to say, oh, this patient died of a burst appendix if that patient had their appendix removed. So it was a very particular kind of cursory medical exam. And then all of the patients were made to undress. They had to divest themselves of all of their personal items. And the nurses walked them into the next room, which was a sealed chamber with an iron door that closed and could be locked, and was the gas chamber itself. Next to the gas chamber was a room called the technical room. The technical room had two large, they're like as tall as a human being, canisters of carbon monoxide, which is lethal when inhaled by human beings. And after the gas chamber was closed and the door was locked, the physician, and this was very important to the Nazis, the physician went into the technical room and applied the carbon monoxide gas to the patients inside of the gas chamber. Can you tell me why the Nazis thought it was very important that the physician was the one who turned the poison gas on? It seems like an odd concern to have when the goal is mass murder.
Wasn't like the health of the population?
Yeah, that's true. So, and Cartwright talks about that, right? The idea was, okay, this wasn't like eugenics wasn't a project that happened to all white people, although Cartwright points out it it was only about weeding out white population so it could maintain its argument about its racial superiority to other races. So it's like a weeding out of the chaff of insufficient people within the white population in order to be able to maintain the fiction of racial superiority among white people. That's kind of a summary of Cartwright's argument. Why would that, though, be a reason why the Nazis argued that the physician had to be the one to turn the gas nozzle?
Assuming it's like a similar legal structure to what we saw in France and the other institutions and governments that we're looking at, like the idea that the hospital or the physician that's what they do, or so they're questioning, subject to people who are voting representation. It's more, they're saying the correct form of treatment that they have to do.
Nice. So, we learned that out of Foucault in part, right? That there's this extrajudicial authority that operates within psychiatric institutions that makes them their own judge, juries, and execution to one degree or another. And only people within the institution have the right to kind of review the institution practice and policies. So I think that's another important aspect of designating that the physician had turned the poison gas knob. Can we get another one? I was thinking in Hartwright's chapter about the fact that he points out that medical professionals who oversaw eugenics were in charge of improving the racial genetic side of the nation. It was a kind of national effort to weed out undesirable people. And I think the Nazis wanted the physician to turn the gas nozzle because they treated gassing as a kind of medical intervention. Something that had to be performed by someone who was certified to make life or death decisions. And secondly, because gassing was considered a kind of release, like if one can imagine mass murder as a kind of release, the idea was release from a life of suffering into an afterlife. And that's how the Nazis discussed it. So, intake room, gas chamber, technical room. The next room was called the autopsy room. And in the autopsy room, people who were considered to have really interesting kinds of disabilities were dissected and anatomized by German physicians in the autopsy room. This also happened in the Holocaust, the Jewish people, when they were killing. And there was a very famous medical illustrator named Kernkopf who worked for the Nazi regime. And I was telling you earlier on the semester Audubon, who has these beautiful drawings of birds, killed the birds in order to get them to hold still and be able to draw them in the detail that he wanted to draw them in. And the same principle was at work really in Nazi medicine, because the autopsy was a place where these kind of very sophisticated diagrams of musculature, internal organ systems were created. And the foundation of much modern medicine, and I'm not going to argue it's not in Germany, almost every country was using textbooks that had drawings by Kernkopf, which were drawings based upon his dissections and anatomizations of people who were killed in the Tiflo program and Jewish people who were killed in the Holocaust. After the autopsy room, there was a room called the body stacking room, where bodies that were waiting to be incinerated were piled up like cordwood. And then the very last room was the crematorium room. The crematorium room had two ovens, and the bodies were cremated 2 and 3 and 4 at a time in the crematory oven. So that when the ash from the cremation fell out, and families, said, I would like the remains of my disabled relative who had been in Weimar psychiatric institution, the Nazis just shoveled up ash from the bodies that had been burned in the oven, not particular or specific to any one of the victims, put them into an urn and sent the urns to the family. This kind of linkage between marriage prohibition, institutionalization, sterilization, and mass murder is really important. Is when Hitler came to power in 1933, the first law that he passed within the German parliament was the sterilization law. And the sterilization law was simply a German translation of the American sterilization law. So in other words, the Americans created the map to a sterilization law that the Germans took up, translated into German, and then used in order to make a law allowing the coercive sterilization of people who were in psychiatric institutions. In that way, using disability offers a much more complex relationship of the United States to Nazi Germany, which we usually think of as kind of hermetically sealed off as a particular bastion of barbarity to one degree or another that the Americans came in and saved. But in many ways, the United States was sitting at the foundation of this process that went on in a program that was codenamed Action T4.